Good evening. Thank you for being here with us. We'd like to give a few comments about what we just heard from Governor Walz and his state of the state. As you know, over the last 2 years, that $18 billion of surplus was spent. Another $10 billion raised on all of us, on all of our taxes and fees, to an unsustainable budget. I was very, very pleased to hear, though, that the governor has realized that we are heading toward a deficit and he wants to make cuts. I was incredibly encouraged by that fact, but we know that making those cuts, it is going to take a lot of collaboration and work as House Democrats and Republicans have come together in our tie, working then with the Senate, eventually with the governor, to see what the cuts really mean. What we do know, though, is cuts on the backs of our students or our seniors, those that are really struggling, those are really off the table. That is not a fair way to do those cuts when we look at the growth of the government here in the state of Minnesota. Those continued conversations will take place, though. The other thing that was encouraging is that the governor has acknowledged fraud. For 6 years under his leadership, fraud has gone unaccounted for. There's been no accountability whatsoever within his agencies, and to know that he is finally taking that serious, I have to think that is because of Republicans pushing in the House to have the Fraud Prevention and Agency Oversight Committee that will be chaired by a Republican, Chair Kristen Robbins, with a Republican majority for the next 2 years, really addressing on the issue of needing to prevent fraud here in the state of Minnesota. That was encouraging to hear that the governor is also starting to recognize that and wanting to do things. We know when you hear finger pointing to Washington and the things that may be happening in Washington, we know finger pointing does not pay for or create our roads, our bridges, fixing and lowering energy costs, providing that funding for schools. So finger pointing right now in the state of Minnesota has no place. We have to focus with what we know, which is that expanded, unsustainable spending in the state, finding budget targets that will work. House and Senate and governor don't quite align right now. We need to focus on governing here in the state of Minnesota. And even with a 23-day delay in the House of Representatives because of our Democrat colleagues not showing up for work, I believe we can still get this work done, obviously in a bipartisan fashion, but specifically on time. By May 19th, we can get this work done. It is going to be a push as we go forward over these next few weeks, but we can get this done, and I have full confidence in that. I want to turn it over to my colleagues. We have Leader Niska and Senate Leader Johnson here with us, and I want you to be able to hear from them, and then we'll take just a few questions toward the end.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Speaker Dameth, and thank you, everybody, for being here tonight. I think what the best part of that speech tonight was it was short, so we can get back home here and get back to work. So we've been seeing the governor constantly be talking about the federal policies that he believes are coming. And the reality is we need to be focused here on the state of Minnesota. For the last 2 years, Republicans have been cut out of the room. And now we're starting to see the consequences of that. We're seeing a budget where we have a deficit coming at us of $6 billion. We need to take that and really figure out what the solution is. The governor's solution is to shift that onto taxpayers, to take that and put it onto our counties. Over $500 million he wants to shift onto our counties. The reality is we can do better. We can do much better in this state. We are one of the highest tax states in the nation. We don't need to be going back to Minnesota taxpayers to get that money. We can figure out how to prioritize this money. On issues that we have across the state, we found areas of compromise, of areas that we can work together on. One of them is the waste, fraud, and abuse in this state. That finally, after 6 years, the governor is finally coming to the table and saying, we've got a problem. Yes, we know that. We've been saying that for 6 years, that we have a problem. We need to address that right away. We're going to make sure that we're putting Minnesotans first, that we're not taking it out on Minnesota schools. We're not taking it out on Minnesota local governments, that we're doing the right things here at the state capitol to make sure that our kids are the best educated, that our streets are the safest, that Minnesota is the place that people want to come and live. That's what we're putting Minnesotans first. With that, I'm going to turn this over to Leader Niska, and you can finish up.
Yeah, thank you. I want to echo Speaker Damath and Leader Johnson's point that our job as leaders here in the state of Minnesota is to be focused on what we need to do here in the state of Minnesota. And the job that all of us should be doing, what the governor should have been doing is an honest reckoning of where we are at, the costs of the one-party Democrat control that have gotten to this place, spending an entire $18 billion surplus, putting us in a looming $6 billion deficit, the costs to our businesses, the cost to our schools, the ways that our schools are being harmed by state policy, and the way that we're failing our students and our communities, and how we're going to work together in this divided legislature in order to get the job done in the state of Minnesota. And unfortunately, what we saw tonight is a continuation of what we've seen from Democrats here, where instead of talking about those issues in Minnesota and those challenges in Minnesota, they constantly want to engage in a Trump deflection strategy where everything is the fault of Donald Trump or of folks outside of the state of Minnesota. I understand that that's good politics for their base, that their base likes to hear, instead of reckoning with the challenges that we have in the state of Minnesota because of Democrat policies, they want to talk about Trump and attack Trump. It was really unfortunate that while there was maybe not quite an olive branch, but maybe a few buds from an olive tree given by the governor, most of it was overshadowed by a quite frankly angry rant about Donald Trump. And I don't think that that serves the state of Minnesota. I don't think that that's the path that we should be taking as leaders in Minnesota. We have to work together. We have to work across party lines. There were a few things in that speech that I think all of us can agree with. The overdue need to take on fraud in the state of Minnesota, the overdue need to reform some of the way that government operates in the state of Minnesota and make it work more for the people of Minnesota. And I hope that we can find a way here in the next few weeks to get past the national politics, then the name calling, the finger pointing that we saw in the speech tonight, and instead get to work on the issues that Minnesotans really need us to work on. Thanks.
At the state level, there was quite a bit of talk about collaboration, unity, how that's been a theme this legislative session. I'm curious, but I mean, what did you guys make of those bits of the speech?
I do want to just go back to the last 2 years in which doors were physically shut in our faces when we tried to have Republican voices heard, when stakeholders were coming to the Capitol to try to make those adjustments to these bills that would make them sustainable and things that Minnesotans across the state could get behind. And so finally, after 2 years, when they've run out of money, when they finally got to this issue of a $6 billion deficit, when our schools are just buckling under the mandates, when our communities are having troubles with our businesses, are starting to look outside the state, then they come to Republicans and say, well, let's work together. It's 2 years too late, but we're there, we're at the table. We aren't missing these meetings with the governor, with the leadership, both in legislature and the governor's office, trying to come back, trying to fix this and figure out solutions to this state. So yes, I love the rhetoric. We're going to be there working with anybody that's willing to put their, put their head to the grindstone here, their nose to the grindstone and get this thing done, because it has to happen. Otherwise, Minnesotans are going to be feeling the pain real soon.
Speaker Damath, did you feel like this was addressed to the state or addressed to the nation? What do you think? Leader Niska talked about that a little bit.
I would say both on that, actually. I think it's important, though, as elected leaders here in the state of Minnesota, Minnesota has to be our first priority. That is my expectation for every one of the members serving in the House, in the Senate, and our governor. Make Minnesota a priority. Focus on what we need to do here for the people of Minnesota first, and then if there's other aspirations, that should come later. We have just a few short weeks, again, started 23 days late because of Democrats not showing up for work. We can still get this done on time, but we have to focus on Minnesota, on what we know, the financial picture that we have been left with. We will be able to get that done and over the finish line.
How has that delay affected your progress just overall?
23 days is a lifetime in session. You might have heard earlier from some of my colleagues across the aisle that we don't really get a lot done the first few days of session. I kind of smile when I think of that, though, because that is also the party that wanted a full-time legislature last year. So we need every day that we work. Those first 23 days are very, very key. House Republicans were in there doing the work as far as informal hearings, different things that we could do to prep us on the issues on every one of the committees that we could. Even though we had that delay, we are committed to getting this done on time in a way. So how does it affect us? It's a challenge, but we can work through that. We definitely don't need a full-time legislature.
Speaker Damith, what do you make of Governor Walz when he was talking about the deficit? He said it was nobody in the room's fault. What do you make of that?
The deficit that has been created, the spending of the $18 billion surplus, raising taxes and fees another $10 billion, and that just happened in 2 years. Governor Walz has been in office for 6 years. He has signed every single one of the bills that has brought us to this point. At a time that we could have used the $18 billion of surplus and maybe gotten ahead or set more away and planned for an unknown future, that was not the case. So I believe that there is a responsibility of some that were in the room.
And just for context on that too, if I could, Mary. So we went from a $52 billion state budget up to a $72 billion state budget in 2 years. And it's gonna look more like a $66 billion budget. But think of that, from $52 billion to $72 billion, 40% growth in the state. And so for the governor to come back and say, this isn't our fault, this isn't the Democrats' fault over the last 2 years, that's pretty disingenuous.
Gaslighting.
I would just add, he said a lot of really crazy things about Donald Trump, like that President Trump is trying to intentionally harm the country. For someone who turns policy differences into questions of motive about somebody else like that, it's really pretty amazing that he's not able to take responsibility for the budgets that he himself passed.
Madam Speaker, yesterday you said that the State of the State speech was an opportunity for the governor, I think you said, pull the parties together. Did he meet your challenge tonight?
I think that there was quite a bit of push toward the federal issues that are either true, not true, created, however you want to look at that. I think that he did a fair amount of positive talk when it comes to fraud and needing to make reductions. When he talks, though, about making sales cut taxes, but expanding that base of sales cut or expanding the tax basis, there are other things that he talked about that seemed unifying, but when you dig into the surface, it is still pretty heavy party talk right now. So I think the better question with that and the better answer will be given in about 3.5 to 4 weeks when you see where we land.
And where do you stand on the increased surcharges for HMOs?
You know what? We have to look at everything right now, but the growth in government at this point, over the last 2 years, 6,000 new FTEs added to just the state government. There are other ways to cut and be more responsible than just dumping something on a health company.
You mentioned I think he mentioned, he didn't say it explicitly, the long-term care waivers and long-term care being such a cost driver. You mentioned, Speaker Damith, you wanted to protect seniors. Are you having productive talks with Democrats in terms of limiting the growth of long-term care waivers and limiting that kind of expensive cost?
We are still stuck on a couple of things on our health budget, but our human services budget, even though there were some reductions made, Democrats and Republicans in the House, our co-chairs came together and did a phenomenal job coming up with a budget that will be able to get passed off the House floor. So those talks are still going on. We know they have to match up with the Senate, but that work already has been done in the House in a bipartisan fashion to this point.
Speaker, what in the governor's speech wasn't true? You alluded that some things he said about Trump or the federal government wasn't true.
You know, when we look at some of the claims that were being made, we know the idea of a Medicaid cut, you know, when he had talked about Medicare cuts before and things like that, that was never in the budget that was being moved through Washington. That was an untruth. It's a great headline, but when you dig into the words of where it actually was, that didn't happen. There were just a few other things. I know you had cut a couple of those too, things that just didn't quite line up, that they make great headlines, but when you dig in, they're not exactly true.
Were you not concerned then that the federal government will make massive cuts in Medicaid? Is that something you see as Walz kind of just inventing, exaggerating?
You know, what we need to do right now is we need to work on the Minnesota state budget, and whatever changes come at a federal level, when those actually, if they actually come through, that is the time to deal with those cuts as known. What we shouldn't do in the Minnesota budget right now is continually adding costs outside of what we can afford, knowing that there could be changes on a federal level. We need to be responsible in what we're doing. That's our focus right now.
Would be a question for anybody who wants to answer. Sensing some disappointment, some glad that he talked about this and that. Do you think this speech did any harm to, you know, the bipartisan work that you will have to do, or do you think you're kind of in the same position that you were at 7 o'clock tonight?
You know, I think I don't know if you want to add to it, but what I would say is, we met with the governor, the 4 leaders, we met with the governor this afternoon, and he said, you know, he was gonna hit some things pretty hard at the federal level, and he obviously did that. I don't think it did anything to necessarily hurt where we are, but I don't think there was any great revelation that brought us even closer together of the work that needs to continue. Kind of a little bit more neutral in a way. I don't know your read on that.
I would say so. I mean, it's kind of like that old cartoon where the sheepdog and the coyote would clock in and they'd beat each other up, and then they'd be, you know, they could work together on the backside. But that's kind of what it's like. We expected some hits today too, but overall, we have work to do. We got to make sure that we're putting Minnesotans first, check our ego, and make sure. But reality is, we're going to be back in the governor's office trying to work on deals going forward. It didn't hurt it, but what we need to do is make sure that we're focusing on Minnesotans' needs. When the school boards are coming in there, superintendents, when the small businesses, making sure that we're listening to them, not doing these red herrings with the federal government and what the administration might be doing and whatnot. So let's focus on Minnesota. That's the top priority. You know, we can have all this rhetoric on the outside, but the reality is we got to get the work done in 3 weeks. Yep.
You know, there's the human service spending and there's K-12 spending, and that's 70-some% of the budget, and I wonder where all this money comes from that you're gonna cut if you take healthcare and disability and K-12 off the table.
No new tax increases. That's what I can guarantee. That is a non-starter for House Republicans at this point.
Do you have some specific places that adds up to solving your budget problem?
That work is still being done. You know, we're going to hear the first budget bills that are going to be on the House floor tomorrow, and you'll see that work continue through over the next few days, and I think that'll give a little bit better indication of where we're at in the House. Right.
Okay.
Thank you.